First of all, I know several people have said this, but I wanted to, from up here, I wanted to thank the board and the staff of the FMAA for what they've done in putting this conference together. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been involved in putting one of the things on, but it's a tremendous amount of work, and they've done a super job. So thanks, guys. I appreciate it. There's also several things that I'm keenly aware of. Number one, nobody likes to bat ninth, right? but it's a spot that has to be filled, and it's the role I've got today. I'm also keenly aware of the fact that I'm standing between you and the rest of your weekend. And so not to shortchange things here, but we're going to move through this fairly rapidly. And we're going to cover the material and then open it up for questions. So if there are specifics that we need to make sure that we cover with you guys before we get out of here, we have an opportunity to do that. By show of hands, let me see, how many of you guys know basically what a TPA is and what they do? Let me see. Okay. 100%. Well, what do you know? My work's done here. Now, what I want to do is, real briefly, is to go through, using the format of 7 questions, a little bit about the history of TPAs, where they came from. The one thing Sean was kind enough not to say is that I've been doing this for an awfully long time, and I've seen a lot of stuff. And some of it good, some of it not so good. But what I want to do is kind of go through some of the history of where TPAs came from, and how we feel like that really ties very well with the free market movement that we're here to learn about, and more importantly, what are some of the market dynamics that we see occurring that are going to create opportunities not only for you guys but for us as well. When I first, kind of the concept for this actually grew out of when I was running my TPA. We would bring new employees in, and they often kind of knew what their job was, but they often didn't really understand how what they did really impacted what the overall mission of a TPA was. And I felt like it was important for everybody to understand the dynamics of not only what you're doing, but why what you're doing is important. And so that was what the genesis of this is. And so we would often get them together and we would go through basically a sales presentation and say, okay, this is what we're selling to the market. This is what we're delivering to our employer customers. And this is why what you do makes a difference. When I first pitched this to the FMMA staff, they said that you could tell there was a moment of panic when I started talking about sales presentation. And I said, no, it's just to put things in context so that they understand what the role of the TPA is, and why that matters and how important that is. And they quickly got on. Now, let me also ask by show of hand, how many other TPAs are here in the room? Okay, we got a few. Okay, I want to point this out because these 7 answers are going to be my answers, and there may well be some things that I don't pick up on that I miss. And so as I go through this, if there's anything that you see that I've omitted at the end, please make sure you jump in and add that color, because I think it'll be important. Okay. Mike just went through ERISA, so I'm not going to spend, I actually had some notes here about what ERISA was, but TPAs as we know them today were actually formed as the direct result of the passage of ERISA in 1974. And I'll just say that it creates the regulatory framework for which self-funded employers operate. Now, a little piece of trivia here. There was actually a companion piece of legislation to ERISA that was called PERISA. Okay? There are 2 segments of the market that are not covered under ERISA: public employers and church plans. Okay, based on that piece of information, would anybody care to guess what PERISA was designed to do? Create the ERISA framework for public employers and church plans, okay? It did not pass. So even back in 1974, this dysfunction's been going for a while, right? So back then, 1974, so since 1974, public employers and church plans, while they may be self-funded, they are not ERISA plans. Now, most of them typically follow the same construct of an ERISA plan, but they are not ERISA plans, and some of the protections that go in an ERISA plan and the participants under those plans are not applicable to public employers and their employees. TPAs originally started out predominantly as local, entrepreneurial, privately owned companies. And later on, I'm going to draw a little bit of a distinction there because I think it's one that's gotten a little bit lost in the market and how important some of that can be. But before 1974, there were some TPAs around. Boone Chapman, for instance, with the TPA that I'm working with now, they were actually formed in 1961. And what they did was they administered association plans for insurance companies. So they were doing back room, but it was not single employer plans, which is typically what we associate with self-funding and TPAs in the market today. But as the passage of ERISA really is what fueled the growth in the TPA and self-funded employer market. That was a very disruptive force in the market of the day. So, you know, back in through the mid-70s and in the early 80s, it was tough sledding. The common reaction to that from the status quo of the day was this self-funding, if it's not illegal, it certainly is immoral. Right? I mean, that's the way the market viewed self-funding of the day. A little story. The founders of MAA were Richard and Jackie Carlson, husband and wife. And the way they got into the TPA business is Richard was actually marketing basically what amounted to a MEWA for Ashland Oil. They had a bunch of broker-dealers across the southwest, southeast part of the United States. Richard was marketing a program that was actually being administered in a fully insured arrangement by the Equitable. But the way they had it set up, those claims were coming through Oklahoma City. They would make sure that everything was there. They'd send it to the Equitable. The Equitable would send the checks back to Oklahoma City, and then the office here would then mail them out to the participant. They'd make sure that the payment was correct, everything right. Things have changed a bunch, right, since that day. So with the passage of ERISA, Ashland Oil calls a meeting in Ashland. Richard goes to it, and they say, look, we want to take this program self-funded. And so they go to the Equitable and say, look, we want to take the claims. We just want you to administer the claims. And they're like, what are you talking about? You know, no, you know, if it's our deal, it's our deal. Because back then there really was no such thing as a TPA. Nobody knew what that was. That moniker didn't even exist. And they said, hey, we got to find somebody to pay these claims. And Richard said, I'll do it. They said, okay. Again, times have changed, right? So he comes home and tells Jackie, okay, this is what we're going to do. And Jackie said, okay. She said, let me get this straight. So we're going to act like an insurance company, but we're really not going to be one. And he said, yeah, pretty much. And she said, are you crazy? Okay. All that to say is kind of belaboring the point. But back then, it was disruptive, right? It challenged the status quo, and the people that were benefiting from the status quo didn't like it. Okay? Can anybody see the the correlation here? Okay? So who we are is important because it's, and you're going to see in a second, and I tend to get ahead of myself, and that's why there's not a lot of detail on the slides, because I'll tend to run ahead of myself. But but it's part of our DNA. It's how we grew up, and we're used to the way these things and the way this innovation can disrupt a market and how we manage that disruption. And then through the process, obviously, we were able to bring options to the market. We brought a level of flexibility and control to an employer, which is at the end of the day, that's what they're after, right? They want to be able to control their own destiny as it relates to the cost of the health care that they deliver to their employees. At the end of the day, that's what they're after, and that's what we were able to deliver. And what the carriers today still are unable to deliver is that same level of flexibility and control. Okay, so what do we do? We're going to go through this, but to me, the core components of what a TPA does is cost control. Okay? At the end of the day, our value to a self-funded employer is almost directly related to how effective we are at controlling the cost of the benefits that they offer to their employees. I mean, certainly there's other things that go into that, and it sounds pretty simple, right? But it's not. You know, one of the things that we have to do as a TPA is we have to understand what role that benefit plays in that employer's plan. So if you think about it, this is a continuum. So you have some employers over here, like we've had a couple of archdioceses, okay, they tend to offer very rich benefits. They don't want any member disruption. They are not overly concerned about cost. They just want a high level of benefit, no member disruption. You have other employers on the opposite end of that spectrum that really could care less about the member experience or how well they like the benefit. They just want it cheap, okay? Now, most employers are going to be somewhere in the middle, but they're going to shade to one end or the other. And, you know, part of the job of a TPA, the broker, all the people that are involved in the advising with that employer is to understand, because at the end of the day, benefits is part of compensation, right? It's part of that pie. Typically, that pie doesn't get any bigger, right? And so Jay made the comment, his employer earlier, where he said, you know, my employer is giving raises, but they haven't really seen a big take-home pay because it's all gone to increases in health care. Okay, that speaks to what I'm talking about here is compensation benefits are part of that. And so the extent we can drive down the cost of the benefits, then the employer, not only the employer wins, but the employee wins because they're able to enjoy the additional disposable income that comes along with that thing. But it is a balancing, right? You have to find that match. But that's what, at the end of the day, that's primarily what our roles are. We also need to support HR and management. Part of that goes into helping them clearly define what the role that TPA or the medical plan has to their compensation. It also speaks to the amount of data that we're able to provide that employer around what the benefit plans are costing, where those cost drivers are, and then what can we do to help them better control the costs to take care of the cost control portion that we just talked about. So we've got to be able to support them through helping them understand the strategy around the plan and then making sure that they're executing on that strategy to make it work for both their employer and the participants of the plan. Customer service, you know, obviously that is a big component of what we do. You know, we have to pay the claims, we have to answer the questions. You know, the old paradigm of the TPA world was we want to pay claims quickly, we want to pay claims accurately, and we want to answer member questions if they have a question about how we did one of the previous two things. I'll tell you, in the new world element, paying a claim quickly is quickly becoming not so important. It's more important for us to make sure we're paying that claim accurately, and more importantly, that we're taking advantage of the cost innovations that are out there like the free market, okay? So now, I will tell you when it comes to this, and then this, I'm going to tie this into the last comment, which is the customer service part. When you look at a TPA, we handle a lot of transactions. Okay, there's a lot of health claims that come through any TPA shop, and so you hear a lot of them talk about error rates in the error rates. Well, if you think about it, so if you're processing 100,000 claims a month and you have a 1% error rate, okay, that's 100 claims that you got wrong. Okay, now that's not too bad, right? I mean, everybody here would say, hey, 99%, that's pretty good. Unless you're that 1% that had your claim paid wrong, then we're 100% wrong, okay? So again, not a complaint, it's just the dynamics of what we need to do. And so we've got to be able to make sure that we're processing those claims quickly. But I think some of those get mitigated as we help them involved in the process and they understand what we need to do. And we're steering them to a free market facility where some of the complexity gets squeezed out of the system, and I'm gonna kind of drip on that topic more as we go through it. Also, as it relates to customer service, and then we're also going to get to a commitment to technology and innovation. There was a gentleman that was in the breakout room that I was in yesterday that made a comment about, he said, the people in this room, most of them are gray-headed and or balding, and in 5 to 7 years, they're going to be gumming their food somewhere, okay? Now I really didn't appreciate the observation, but it was kind of hard to argue the point he was trying to make, right? But as the baby boomers, which that's us guys, right? So the baby boomers, we're starting to leave the marketplace. And the backfilling is occurring by this group of people that get referred to as millennials, okay? They have a completely different worldview of things that go well past healthcare, okay? But trust me, healthcare is going to become more important. I just saw a study, and this said, hey, here are the top 10 things that an employer needs to understand are important to millennials, okay? Would somebody care to guess what the number one thing was? Medical benefits. Medical benefits. They get it, okay? Number two, just coincidentally, student debt. Hey, help me pay this off. But they are technology, right? I mean, I've got grandkids that know how to work my iPhone better than I do, okay? And we're talking 2 and 3 year olds. And I don't really think I'm that incompetent. Really, they're just that good at that early an age. Okay, so trust me, guys. They are going to challenge us mightily in how we utilize technology and innovation, and they will be drawn to what we're doing here. No question. And at the end of the day, an employer is offering benefits for 2 main reasons. Any guesses on what those 2 main reasons are? Employer, attracting and retaining, okay? So remember, there's a lot more baby boomers on this spectrum than there are millennials that are on this end of the spectrum, okay? So what's going to happen? We're fixing a fist fight for labor. All of us, I mean, anybody that's running a company, it's going to become increasingly harder to get millennials to work. And hey, they have really no interest in working for the same employer for 30 years. They're like, huh? You know, it's kind of like when you tell them, hey, I used to have to get up and turn a knob on my TV to get a different channel. They're like, what are you talking about? I said, yeah, and it went off at 10:30 too. Look up. And they're like, huh? Right? So change is inevitable. And hey, it's going to happen, you know, and it's like any other change. There's going to be some, but change creates opportunity. And I think what we're learning today is that's another component that's going to drive what we're trying to do here with the free market. Okay, so why TPAs? And this is really more specifically as it relates to you know, the free market. As I said earlier, it's in our DNA. Now here's where, and y'all may have noticed a couple times that when I've referenced TPAs, I've referenced independent TPAs, and I think even Mike alluded to this a little earlier during his speech. So let me kind of help for those of you who really don't know. So for those of you that do, just forgive me for a second. So I'm going to classify TPAs, and I'll start out by saying there's an old adage in the TPA industry: when you've seen one TPA, you've seen one TPA. Okay, so how we do the same job so differently is kind of amazing, and I've been there, but that is actually a true statement, and there's some reasons that I'm not going to go into today on why that is, but at the end of the day, we are all different. But to me, the key component, and the component that oftentimes does not get the attention or even the recognition for the value it brings, is the independent TPA. So when I say independent TPA, I'm talking about a TPA that is not owned by an insurance company, or that is an insurance company, a TPA that's owned by a venture capital or someone on Wall Street, or that's owned by a hospital, okay? All those exist, okay? So to me, an independent TPA is a TPA that is owned by a privately owned individual, many of which are involved, if not directly, their family is involved in the running of that business. The reason that's important is because it was mentioned several times already, is the aligned incentives. Because there's often times in this business where you have to do something, and you have to do it just because it's what needs to happen. And this is not an economic decision. It's not a balance sheet or a P&L decision. It's just a decision that this is the way it has to happen because it's the right thing to do. If you're owned by one of those other entities, that doesn't happen, right? And that's not a criticism, that's a statement of fact. And so one of the key components, and I'm going to hit a slide here in just a few minutes that's going to talk about this, and we'll dive into this in a little more detail then. But it's vitally important for you to understand that the independent TPAs, to me, are the ones that are going to readily embrace what we're doing here with the free market incentives or initiatives that we're driving here. The new age consumerism. I'm gonna, some of this stuff is, goes back to the millennials, but it also, there's an interesting thing that says, some people buy inflatable Santa Clauses and they put them on the rooftop, and so you have to ask and chuckle, is that really necessary? Right? No, not really. Right? But then when you ask somebody about flat screen TVs, is that really necessary? Well, all of a sudden they don't really chuckle, right? Because at the end of the day, the truth is that the needs we have, the ultimate needs we have, there's not very many of them. Healthcare is one of them, right? I mean, unfortunately, it happens, right? People get sick, people get hurt, and they have to be dealt with. The core root of the problem is that when they go and consume these services, they have absolutely no idea what it costs. And the sad part of it is that some of them, They don't care what it costs. Okay? Again, it's a statement of fact. It's the only segment of our economy where that occurs. Everybody else, when you go to buy something, you know exactly what it is. Now, there are reasons, some of them are very good reasons for why that doesn't necessarily occur, but at the end of the day, that's what is creating the issue that we've got, and why what's happening here is so revolutionary and creates, you know, such an opportunity. So let's look at the competition. So we're looking at a new age of consumerism. When you start looking at, you know, there was a study, the non-healthcare related. So let's set healthcare aside, since we've already kind of established that, you know, we kind of march to a little different drummer. The top-rated non-healthcare companies as it relates to, you know, innovation, customer service. Would anybody care to guess what the number one top-rated non-healthcare consumer company would be? Apple. Exactly right, Apple. Okay. That's not a real good correlation for me, because that's a vertically integrated, right? They manufacture it, they market it, they sell it, they service it, so it's vertically integrated, and it's a little easier for them to manage those components because they kind of control it top to bottom, okay? Number two, any guesses on what number two might be? Amazon, exactly right. So Amazon's number two. Now Amazon, it's a little closer, right? Because they don't control it all. I mean, they're really a clearinghouse, right? So they have all these vendors coming there. So as it relates to the millennials, just think, you know, I was talking about, you know, the little guys are getting this technology. That's what they're going to grow up with. They're going to understand that that's the way. And so I think to the extent we can get there, it's not impossible, right? And so when you look at this, so we had a kind of a sidebar. Colin was over here. We were having a sidebar conversation about this, and the comment that was made was, you know, at the end of the day, a healthcare transaction is a financial transaction. It's a batch transaction, very much like a bank. Okay, they're very similar. Okay, the difference is at a bank, it's a much simpler. There's no third-party intervention. There's none of that. So it's a little more complex. But at its root, we're processing those types of transactions just like a bank. Well, how many of you guys do banking on your phone right here? Deposits? Yep, right? A lot of you do it. Check your balance. It's all right there, okay? So how many of y'all feel like that you're able to do the same things with your health plan that you do with your bank? Right? Yep, there we go. Good for you. Very few, right? I mean, so there is a gap between the way banks have managed that technology component to this and the way healthcare is done. Again, there's some good reasons for why that is, but you think about it. Some of that complexity revolves around the PPOs, right? You have to get the PPO to reprice that claim. It has to be processed. Sometimes they don't get it right. So there's a level of complexity there, but if you eliminate the PPO, again, you're back to the willing seller and the willing buyer. It becomes a much simpler process. All right, creative disruption in the marketplace. We've talked a little bit about that, but I saw an interesting thing is in the last 15 years, 52% of the Fortune 500 companies have disappeared. You think about that. In 1955, the average life expectancy of one of those companies was 75 years. Would anybody care to guess what that was in 2016? 15 years. Okay? So, there's a gentleman yesterday that made some comment about, that if no one's controlling the supply side of healthcare, then maybe there's some justification for controlling the supply side, right? And that goes back to the point I was making earlier. When the consumer does not know what they're paying for, there is no way to control demand, and those are the things that we're going to have to address. And part of that gets into us changing the way that we talk about and that we manage it. There was an article I read, and I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get this right. How behavioral economics can produce better health care. Now, this was actually written by a physician, and it also talked about some of the things that went on in a clinical setting. And I just thought it was interesting. It said the article stated in part, people don't always make decisions, even hugely important ones, about physical or financial well-being based on careful calculations of risk and benefits. Rather, our behavior is powerfully influenced by our emotions, identity, and environment, as well as how options are presented to us. People overwhelmingly tend to stick with default options when given a choice. Organ donation rates are over 90% in countries where citizens need to override a default, where it's only 4 to 27% when they have to opt in, okay? His comment was, he says, oftentimes I wind up dispensing a drug, and why do I dispense that drug is because it's it's the default option in the software package that I'm using. Okay, so whether you're talking about how the care gets delivered, certainly to the way that we consume it through the healthcare system, we're going to have to approach this from a little different. It's been a solely focused on the financial components of it, and I think there is a behavioral component that we're going to have to try to get our arms around. And actually, I think the millennials are going to kind of drive us that way fairly quickly, because I think they're going to change that whole paradigm. And so when it comes to healthcare economics, it's not necessarily going to be just the dollars and cents, but there's going to be a behavioral component to this that we're also going to have to deal with. All right. So when does it make sense for an employer to work with an independent TPA? Now, to me, this side kind of encompasses the opportunities that we're all here to pursue, okay? The number one is when the status quo becomes too burdensome on the plan and the employees. So on the status quo, when I say status quo, I'll just use it, it's just a regular PPO plan. They've got a PPO out there. They're taking the discounts. So what has been the status quo? Typically, the net result is you increase deductibles and or you increase what you charge the employee, okay? I think we all understand that is not a sustainable model. It's not something that can continue. Matter of fact, the gentleman earlier today said when his grandkid got to 18, it was going to cost her $20,000 a year or whatever, for health care. Certainly it's not something that we need to do that, but I think the status quo is becoming too painful. Somebody asked the question earlier, why don't employers, these are smart, big companies, why don't they do it? And again, some of this goes back to this, what I was talking about here, this whole behavioral thing, right? The status quo is kind of tough to beat, and as long as they're only getting a 5% increase, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing because they have to do a lot of stuff to do something differently. But when that pain of continuing to do what you do gets big enough, that's when the real innovation is going to do. And my sense is the market is ready for that, and I think that's what's going to drive the opportunities for the folks that are in this room. An employer has to be ready to manage and take an active role in the management of that plan. Touched on that a little bit, but you can't just say, okay, my rate increase is this, and that's what it is. You've got to be willing to dig into the details. You've got to be able to think outside the box, and you've got to be willing to not take a one-size-fits-all solution, okay? Typically, that's associated with the carriers, okay, right? This is our plan, this is the way we do it, you need to do it this way. And oh, we're getting a great discount, okay? Whereas the TPAs, our DNA is, hey, let's try something different, let's try something new, and let's figure out how this works. Some of the conversation that we had today with Mike and with Tim yesterday, around the RBP, a lot of these things, these are all relatively new solutions that have taken hold, and guess what? The early adopters of these things don't always get it exactly right. All right, and so some of what we're seeing here that kind of seems a little ridiculous from where we sit today, at its genesis, it made sense what they were doing. It's just as the market matured and as it grew, some of these issues, and I'll tell you guys, we'll encounter the same thing with some of the stuff that we're trying to do here. We're probably not going to get it right every single time, but I think as long as we have the communication, one of the most valuable things to me is historically, it's been a situation where we've had employers and payers on one side of the table and providers, whether it be a doctor or a hospital on the other side of the table, and it's really been an adversarial relationship, and at the end of the day, it's not served either of us very well. And so to me, the most exciting part of it is we're able to get all stakeholders around the table and understand what the needs are and then how we can design a solution that addresses all of those needs. And I think reasonable people around the table can come up with reasonable solutions. I think that's what we're trying to do here. And I think that's what's ultimately going to make us successful. I've already talked about the labor supply requiring a lot of differentiation. We're going to have to fist fight for labor, and to the extent that you're able to deliver benefits that work better and cost less, then they're going to be successful in attracting the resources that they need to get their job done. And then the value of aligned incentives, I mentioned that earlier. That goes back to the independent TPAs and working with people that have the tenets of the free market, where we want to make sure that we're being transparent and that the buyers understand exactly what they're paying and what they're buying for what they're paying. And I think that's going to increase in visibility and importance. Okay, where? All right, so I'm going to say right up front, I have no idea where that map came from. Okay, so I don't want you to think that somehow that map is representative of all the TPAs that operate in the United States. What it's designed to show is that at its core, healthcare is a local phenomenon. So to the extent we can keep that local, which again is a TPA, right? They're in the market. They know the provider. Sean's in here. We meet regularly. He's in Austin, and we meet regularly. We know what's going on in that marketplace as he does. So there's a comfort level and there's an ability to communicate and to collaborate that doesn't exist if you're sitting there going, okay, now what hospital is that? I thought it was that hospital. So it helps things. Now, when it comes to domestic tourism, in all markets, you're not going to find providers that want to follow this model. And so there is going to be an element of medical tourism, domestic medical tourism, that's going to occur. What my prediction is, and actually this kind of came out, I thought it was really interesting. I happened to be meeting with one of those national PPOs that was mentioned earlier. We'll just say Network C, and actually I was going through and talking to them about what we're doing here with the bundle pricing and stuff, and it was with their network people, which was. That was, I don't have time to go through all that today, but it was very interesting and enlightening to see. But at the very end, his question was this. He said, well, but you're not really saving anything. You're just reallocating. And I had to stop and think for a second. And I said, yeah, you know, yeah, I will accept that. That's correct. I said, now, but your perspective is we're not saving the system anything, but I'm for sure saving my employer who's paying me. I'm saving him money, but we're not squeezing anything out of the system. I said, but let me put it this way. If enough of the employers out there start utilizing free market principles and practices that are following these free market principles, guess what? It creates the need for efficiencies across the entire spectrum of what we're doing in order for them to compete. Because as we all learn in the big bad world, you know, this is not a fourth grade baseball game where we don't keep score. Okay, there are winners and there are losers in what we do, and the more of this we can get, if they don't want to lose, they're going to have to figure out a way to compete on cost and quality, and I'm going to talk a little more about that in just a second. But that's what the play is going to be, because if they don't, they're going to have to quit doing whatever it is that we're doing over here on the free market side, which is not going to help them, okay? So all that to say, we want to keep this local. There was a question, and it was from a provider, and they're like, you know, how do we, you know, as a provider that's doing these kind of things, you know, how do we kind of figure this out? And, you know, what I would encourage you, if you're sitting there kind of wondering the same thing, you know, I would look for an independent TPA in your area, and sit down. Now, hey, look, so we got the TPA family, right? And then there's the physician family and the hospital family, the stop loss family. Okay, we all have those crazy uncles that just don't know how to act right, and they do stupid things. Okay. So we all have that, and we all have to admit it, right? I mean, you know, there are some TPAs that don't know how to act. If you run into one of those and you're sitting there going, man, where is this guy coming from? Yeah, there's more. You know, so go find a TPA. I'll tell you, the one thing I've been amazed in the almost 30 years I've been doing this, the TPA community is extremely open. We meet with our peers all the time. We're very open about what we do and how we do it and some of the challenges that we have. And so, again, getting back to the DNA thing, that's part of their DNA. It's part of what they want to do. And most of them will immediately get an opportunity, particularly with Dr. Smith out there. You know, he's really kind of taken the lead and have met a lot of my peers. And I think he could speak better than most to, you know, most of them would love the opportunity to sit down with you and talk about how can we make this happen in our community. And I think it's going to be a win-win for everybody. So if you're in that deal, I would encourage you to try to find a local independently owned TPA and just open the conversation with them about how you can make these things happen where you live. All right, so how do we do what we do? Well, I could spend forever on that, and I'm not going to try to do that. But at the end of the day, the number one thing is ongoing value. So Jason, I'll pick on Jason's a client. So Jason, we have a 1-year deal, right? Right. So TPAs typically operate on annually renewable contracts. Okay. So what does that mean? And I'll tell you, we have vendors come to us and they want a 3-year deal. That always just kind of rubs me the wrong way, because at the end of the day, I have a 1-year deal. I have to perform today, or when it comes up for renewal, they're going to take their ball and go home, and that's not going to be good for me. Okay, that results in a high degree of accountability on what we do and how we do it. And I personally think that's a good way to do it. And so, but I think y'all need to understand that as well. So as you enter these agreements, I think you need to be willing to say, look, yeah, we'll do a 1-year deal. If we don't pay our way, then we're going to get kicked to the curb, because I think at the end of the day, it forces you to make sure that you do what needs to be done for the employer, because you want to retain them as a client. Memorable experiences. Again, this is going to get back to, the millennials. I'll just suffice it to say this is going to be a requirement for them. We've got some ramp up time, but we're going to have to figure out ways to do memorable experience. And I'm not just talking about on the TPA side. This is going to apply to the providers in the room as well. You've got to figure out a way to make that member feel like their needs are important. They're important to you, and that you're going to address whatever their needs are, and make sure that they're happy with the way that was done. On-demand fulfillment, we've already talked about Amazon, but what's another example? Anybody got another example of on-demand fulfillment? How about Uber? There you go. Boy, I tell you what, you guys are great. Yeah, Uber. How many of y'all have done that? Right? Yeah, good bit. Yeah. I do that all the time, right? And you think about it, before Uber came along, it was no big deal. Call a cab or whatever you're going to do, right? Now right there, and they tell you how long it's going to take for them to get there and pick you up, and they got your picture, you know what their license plate number is. So all that stuff is to say we're going to have to figure that stuff out, because it is becoming the norm for these millennials. And I want y'all to say, I hope nobody's taking this that I'm somehow kind of grinding on the millennials. I personally think it's great. I think it's awesome, but it is going to create some challenges in how we do our business day in and day out. And I think we need to understand that and accept it. Real time anyway. That goes back to the cell phone thing. There's an expectation now that they can access that. Real time data in our business gets a little tricky, because sometimes people go get a prescription and then they don't get it filled, and then that gets reversed out, and so you got all of this stuff that can happen. Claims get mispriced, claims get miscoded. There's all of this stuff in there that can create some real challenges for us as it relates to real time, anywhere access to information. But somehow we're going to have to figure out how to do that. And then personalized service, I think I've kind of ridden that horse as far as it needs to be ridden. Okay, how much? So, Mike earlier said, hey, you need to insist when you're looking at whether it's a TPA or a vendor or whatever, you need to ask them, are your fees all encompassing or whatever? Guys, I'll tell you, under ERISA, and it was mentioned earlier, I think Jay mentioned it this morning earlier, that ERISA has really been one of the most robust forms of patient protection that's been out there. I mean, it's done a phenomenal job of protecting the way that these benefits are and making sure that the money that gets contributed to these plans gets spent for the benefit of those beneficiaries. Part of that process is, though, that as a party in interest to a self-funded plan, which a TPA definitely is, which a stop-loss carriers, with anybody that's handling their thing. They are in party and interest. And it's required under ERISA that they disclose everything that they're going to be paid under that arrangement. Okay? I can tell you right now that doesn't happen. Okay? Even though it's supposed to, and if they're ever audited by the DOL, that'll come out and it creates some real uncomfortable situations for some people. And the enforcement of that, I'll tell you, is increasing, which I personally view as a really good thing, because it's going to accelerate the exit of the market of some of the bad players that we have to deal with. I don't really want to go into the question about the lawsuit and getting that all going, but I do think that that at some point I do believe it's going to happen, and it's going to be that kind of Enron event, if you want to look at it that way, that's really going to accelerate that change. Competition is going to be in cost and quality. I kind of mentioned that already, and we're going to have to treat it like we do all the other major segments of our economy. It's kind of interesting, when we were going through the whole, by the way, what happened to PPACA, right? All of a sudden just went to ACA. I think that's sad, right? They just kind of said, oh, well, let's ignore that. But when we were going through that process, obviously from a TPA's perspective, there was a little bit of concern, right, about, what impact's that going to have on our business. My employees are sitting there going, am I still going to have a job? And so obviously they looked to me, right? They said, okay, well, what do you think's going to happen? And I said, look, guys, I don't know if I had the answer to that question, I'd be somewhere else making a lot of money. And I said, but here's my prediction. I said, so far, anytime Washington, D.C. has gotten involved in health care, they've made it more complex and more expensive. So until they prove me wrong, that's what I'm going to bet. Was I right? Right? That's exactly what happened. Would anybody care to guess what R&R is going to do? Okay. If we get it done at all. That's not the answer. They're not going to fix our problem. I think that's been stated a couple of times already, but for the record, I agree. But demand for healthcare is going to continue to increase, so we're going to have to do something about it. As I mentioned, these baby boomers, we're kind of moving on the backside. So, for the physicians in the room, I think y'all can help us understand what happens over there, right? We typically tend to have a few more issues. We start gumming our food in 5 to 7 years, those kind of things. And that there's usually issues that have to be dealt with on that end, and that costs money. And so we're going to have to figure it out, and our fuse is getting very short on doing it, and that's why I'm excited about what's happening here and the potential that this represents for the people that are willing to get on board and help drive this movement. And then finally, let's not be Danny Simpson. Does anybody know this story? If you do, just keep it to yourself for a second. All right. In 1990, there was a 24-year-old gentleman by the name of Danny Simpson who was from Ottawa, Canada. And he was unfortunately arrested for robbing a bank of $6,000. And he had to go to jail for 6 years for that. Okay? It was armed robbery. The gun that he used turned out to be a .44 caliber Colt revolver that was manufactured in 1918 and was worth $100,000. Come on, guys. Hey, let's don't be Danny Simpson, okay? Let's don't be Danny Simpson. Let's take what we have and let's figure out a way to use it for the good. Thank you.
All right, we got a little bit of time for questions. Got one right there.
Yes, sir. I'm Dr. Jeff Davenport. I'm a direct primary care doctor here in Oklahoma. I won't speak for every direct primary care doctor in the country, but I feel like I have a pretty good pulse of what some of us think around the country and especially in this region. And one of the questions I would have to you and actually the other TPAs in the room is we talk a lot about direct primary care and how it can help facilitate some of this free market movement and really help cost containment, et cetera. One of the things that we've been talking about around the country and in the region is how can we as DPC doctors team with TPAs and be brought to the table sometimes to educate these companies on what DPC is. Obviously there are some TPAs in the room and they know or understand DPC a little bit, but in my opinion, I feel like no one can really sell our product like us.
Right.
And that has been somewhat disappointing so far as, in my mind, I'm thinking every year, these companies come up for renewal. When is the year where we are going to start being introduced to the CFO, CEOs, HR people in these companies and explain what we do and explain how we can help those companies, and then begin to plant those seeds for the companies to then maybe begin to say, well, maybe we should offer that as an option, maybe not convert the whole company, but
So
comment.
So let me ask another kind of a follow-up question. Do you participate with PPOs?
No, sir.
You do not. Okay. So here's what I would do, because I bet you're probably going to wind up being out of network. If they come to you guys and say, hey, did you enjoy the experience you had? Did I do a good job for you? If so, would you go back and talk to your HR department or whoever your contact is that runs the medical plan at your company and see if there's an opportunity for us to talk about how we might be able to do this for the rest of your coworkers at your company? I'm going to tell you, you'd be amazed at how often they'll go back and go, hey, I think there's a better way for us to do this. And again, particularly when you're talking about the millennials, if you got the younger folks, they will, okay? The baby boomers, you kind of trick on them and kind of encourage them. But if you'll do that, I think you'll see, because at the end of the day, the employers are the ones that ultimately are the ones that are paying the bill for all of this stuff. They're the ones that have the biggest vested interest in making sure that they're delivering the best quality at the lowest price. And there's no question that this can do that. And so to the extent we can get them engaged in that conversation, I think it's going to be an easy sell. But some don't. Again, I go back to this status quo, right? You're going to find, so don't, it can't be I tried that once and it didn't work with this employee. It's got to be part of that follow-up, that making sure they have an exceptional experience when they come to your clinic, your office. Make sure they do that, and when they do, say, oh, by the way, would you talk with your HR about us maybe doing this for all your employees, and then you can figure out a way to make that happen. There may be a role for the TPA. It may be a direct contract where they're just, referring their patients directly to you. So, I mean, there's going to be any number of different avenues that you pursue to do it, and they may not all be the same. Part of the challenge we run into is what I said earlier. You got all these, each employer looks at their benefits a little differently. Some of them, yes, some no. But you're going to find a large number of them that are going to be in the middle, that are going to be willing to have that dialogue with you and figure out if we can figure out a way to make that work. And that's the way I would go about it.
Just a comment or question there. So what I've been told is that HR people are typically kind of vested in the status quo, and that the people to talk to, because I think it's a phenomenal idea, but what I'm told is that you want to get to the CFO or the CEO, because they're the ones that will lead the change, where the HR people are just trying to keep people happy.
Right. And that's what I said when I said whoever's in charge of the medical plan, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be most familiar with what that cost is and what it needs to be, in order for them to, make their goal or make a bonus or, whatever it is. Everybody does it a little differently. So, but you got to get to the decision maker, the guy that's willing to say, well, heck yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let's figure out a way to do it.
Over here. So I got kind of shift gears and just interested in something. I'm direct care as well, and in rural area. And the vast majority of my patients who are insured, they do not get their insurance from an employer. Most of them are farmers, they work for some small business, one or two employees, and they say, well, all right, whatever, we'll give you $300 raise every month, and you can go find your own type of deal. And I've just been hearing all TPA, and then also I hear it at the end of the day a lot. But anyway, what I want to know is this coming? Is there going to be a point to where okay, my employer for 50 or 80 or 80 years takes care of my health care insurance. Health insurance, health care are not the same thing. But my point is, they don't buy your car, they don't buy your food, your toothbrush. I mean, why do they got to buy your insurance? Why do they got to, I mean, I know I'm like way outside of the reservation and asking this question. Maybe I'm in the future too much, but I mean, why do they got to buy that at all? Why not? And I understand, yeah, it's a group, you can get it cheaper and all, I get it, pooled risk. But my point is, if we can keep doing free market principles, why not let us just, hey, give our patients, or our employees a raise and then let them figure it out. If that happens with the non-ACA compliant, I mean, is that going to happen? Can we, because with direct care, with what we do, a good catastrophic hospitalization type policy, with what we do will save people a fortune.
Right.
And they don't need these big bloated, plans. And right. You add to it the free market stuff that outside of the primary care area. So you get into, Surgery Center of Oklahoma and those kinds of people that are doing good free market, then we don't need all this. So just, would you mind tell me what the future holds? What can we do there? Because I've got 8 out of 10 people saying, help me find insurance.
Right. So, what you're speaking to is, again, one of the symptoms that we have of the healthcare system that we have today. And I think that's a very fair question. The problem is there are so many different factors that go into what you just enumerated there that trying to come up with a cogent answer to that multifaceted problem is a little tricky. So because, when you're talking about as TPAs, at the end of the day, what we're talking about at the end of the day is health insurance, right? And insurance by nature is defined by the law of large numbers. You got to get enough homogeneous exposure units exposed to a risk, and when you do that, it becomes predictable and it becomes budgetable, and you can understand how to do it.
Right. That's car insurance, though. Your employer didn't buy your car insurance, but yet we all have it.
Right.
That's all I'm saying. You still get your numbers.
Right. So at the end of the day, so to that point, I would say I don't believe you're going to see anything happening anytime soon. Okay? And here's why. Is because with the ACA, the federal government, even when you start talking about single payer, and trust me, when there's no R&R, we're going to start hearing that come back up again, right? Well, with single payer, and they're going to use the term Medicare for all, but at the end of the day, the federal government knows without employer money, they cannot afford the cost of the system as it exists today. At the end, that's the bottom line. And that's why all this is just going to be so much pomp and circumstance around this whole issue. And that's why that kind of rode off in the sunset, is because at the end of the day, part of the problem that we have on the commercial side are the costs that our clients are facing is the fact that the government's not paying their fair share of the bill, anything, and that's getting cost shifted to the commercial, and that's why DaVita's ringing that bell when it's a commercial client that they've got a hold of. So all that goes in, it's the way that the system has matured, and with all its dysfunction starting back in 1974, like I said, that has led us to where we are today. So we're going to take, that's for sure an elephant in the room that's got to be addressed, but the way you eat the elephant's one bite at a time, and I think that's what we're trying to do here today. So, but it's not going to be a quick fix for you. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't it seem that the health plan of the ACA is actually spawned a good bit of activity of the FMMA because of the big deductibles? Do you see anything that's going to change that in the foreseeable future?
Well, that's really hard to say, because I'll tell you, there is, the ACA, it's awful easy just to kind of classify everything as black and white, right? They got it, and but in this world, in the real world, there are gray areas. I'll tell you that there are parts of the ACA that I think were very well reasoned and were appropriate, okay? But there's an awful lot of it that's not. And they were a little selective about the parts of the ACA that they decided to focus on and enforce. There is an entire component about transparency in the ACA that's got very little, if any, attention in there. And I'd encourage all of you to go out there and look at what the ACA says about transparency. And I think it's going to create the framework, and I think that's what's created some of this, and it was the genesis behind it, is that. But at the end of the day, you know, we've got to figure out free markets. We can't wait. The government's not going to fix this for us. We're going to have to fix it for ourselves. And us getting together, providers, payers, and the service vendors that serve that market is where that's where the change is going to be driven from. All right. Thank you.